He has been called many things: a murderer, a rebel, a folk hero, and the most dangerous outlaw America ever produced. To some, Jesse James was a ruthless criminal who killed without hesitation. To others, he was a symbol of Southern resistance, a man shaped by war, driven by vengeance, and forever unwilling to surrender. But who was he really? A villain? A hero? Or something far more complicated? This is the story of a boy born into a nation divided, a young soldier forged in the fires of civil war, and a man who spent the rest of his life fighting ghosts he could never escape. This is the rise, the fall, and the assassination of Jesse Woodson James, a name that still divides America more than a century after his death. To many, he was a cold-blooded killer, a thief, and a ruthless outlaw. But to others, he was the last true rebel of the Old South, a man shaped by war, driven by loss, and fueled by the desire for revenge. His story isn't just the story of a criminal, it's the story of a fractured nation, a nation torn apart by civil war, politics, and rage. And Jesse James grew up right in the middle of that storm. The year was 1847. In rural Clay County, Missouri, a baby boy was born in a small farmhouse surrounded by hemp fields. His mother, Zerelda, was strong-willed and sharp-tongued. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist preacher searching for a better life. But that life never came. Only 3 years after Jesse was born, his father left for the California gold rush and died there, far from home. Jesse grew up without a father, without guidance, and with a deep sense of abandonment that never fully left him. Missouri at that time was a border state trapped between two worlds. To the north, industry, abolition, and progress. To the south, plantations, slavery, and tradition. Clay County leaned heavily towards Southern values, including the use of enslaved labor on farms like the one Jesse grew up on. This tension shaped Jesse long before he understood it. By the time he reached his early teens, America was already cracking apart. In 1861, the impossible happened. Civil war erupted. Abraham Lincoln had been elected president, and the Southern states began breaking away, forming the Confederacy. Missouri became one of the most dangerous, divided places in the entire country. Jesse was only 13 when the war came to his doorstep. His older brother, Frank James, immediately joined the Confederate cause. Jesse wanted to follow him, but he was too young. Still, the war didn't wait for him. Union soldiers raided the James family farm, searching for Confederate guerrillas. They interrogated Zerelda's new husband. They terrorized the household. Some accounts even say they whipped young Jesse across the back, a humiliation he never forgot. That moment planted a seed of hatred in him, and it was a hatred that would define the rest of his life. By 16, Jesse James wasn't a boy anymore. He joined a violent group of pro-Confederate guerrillas who fought outside the rules of conventional war. There were ambushes, raids, executions, and torture. In this brutal world, Jesse learned to kill without hesitation. War had taken everything from him: stability, innocence, even his sense of right and wrong. All that remained was anger, and he believed the only way to avenge his pain was to keep fighting long after the war ended. This was the beginning of Jesse James. Jesse's entry into the war wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, it was desperate. By 1864, the Civil War had reached its bloodiest stage. Missouri had become a battleground of shifting loyalties and ruthless violence. Regular armies fought on open fields, but in the shadows, another kind of war was unfolding. A guerrilla war, savage, personal, and unforgiving. And Jesse James became one of its youngest recruits. He joined a guerrilla band under Fletch Taylor, a group of rough, unpredictable fighters, most of them barely older than Jesse himself. They weren't soldiers in the traditional sense, they were bushwhackers, men who believed the war had no rules and acted like it. Jesse had to adapt quickly. In this world, hesitation meant death. The moment you drew your gun, you committed yourself to whatever came next. At first, the older fighters mocked him. He was small, quiet, and still carried the softness of youth, but that changed the moment he took part in his first killing. After that day, no one laughed at him again. The war hardened him. Every raid, every ambush, every corpse left behind carved away the remaining innocence he had. His anger deepened, and the lines between justice and revenge blurred beyond recognition. But the defining moment of his wartime life came when Jesse and his brother Frank joined one of the most feared guerrilla leaders in Missouri, William Bloody Bill Anderson. Anderson was a man whose reputation alone caused Union soldiers to tremble. He believed mercy was a weakness. He believed cruelty was a weapon. And Jesse, desperate for belonging and consumed by resentment, admired him. Under Anderson, Jesse saw things no teenager should ever see. He witnessed prisoners mutilated. He witnessed executions carried out without hesitation. He witnessed his mentors praise brutality as if it were a badge of honor. Jesse didn't just learn violence, he learned to live with it. One day, during a casual moment on horseback, Jesse spotted a saddle he wanted. When he reached for it, a Union soldier hidden nearby fired a bullet straight through Jesse's chest. He fell, bleeding heavily, barely conscious. He survived, but the wound scarred him for life, physically and mentally. He later told someone he wished the soldiers had finished him, but Jesse James didn't die that day, and in surviving, he became even more dangerous. By the fall of 1864, Jesse was still healing when one of the most horrific acts of the Civil War occurred, an act he would be connected to forever: the Centralia Massacre. A train carrying Union soldiers was stopped by Jesse's guerrilla group. The soldiers were pulled out, lined up, mocked, and slaughtered in cold blood. Their bodies were mutilated, and the train was set ablaze. Whether Jesse personally shot anyone that day has long been debated by historians, but one thing is certain: he was there. He was a part of the group responsible, and the violence of that event only drove the divide in his soul deeper. Shortly after Centralia, Bloody Bill Anderson was killed in an ambush. Jesse and Frank were forced to flee Missouri, one going to Kentucky, the other to Texas, each trying to escape the collapsing remnants of the Confederacy. Jesse was shot again while attempting to surrender near Lexington. A bullet lodged itself in his lung. The pain was unbearable, and doctors at the time could barely treat wounds like these. Jesse spent months bedridden, drifting in and out of fever, listening as the news slowly reached him. The war was over. The Confederacy had fallen. Everything he had fought for, everything he had bled for, had lost. For many, the end of the war meant peace. For Jesse James, it meant something else. It meant the beginning of his true life as an outlaw. Because Jesse didn't forgive, he didn't forget, he didn't heal. He decided it was time to continue the fight, on his own terms. The war had ended, but the fire inside Jesse James had not. He returned to Missouri in late 1865, a wounded teenager, but no longer a boy. He had seen violence, lived through chaos, and felt the sting of defeat deeper than most men twice his age. Missouri, like Jesse, was broken. Neighbors who once shared meals now eyed each other with suspicion. Entire towns were divided between those who had supported the Union and those who had fought for the Confederacy. To Jesse, the Union's victory wasn't just a political outcome. It felt personal. It felt humiliating. He believed that the North had robbed his family, destroyed his home, and taken everything he cared about, and he was determined to take something back. In the winter of 1866, Jesse reunited with his brother Frank and several former guerrilla fighters. They were young men, hardened by war and unfit for quiet farm life. They had spent years surviving through ambushes, raids, and gunfire. Peace to them felt unnatural. They needed a new purpose. Jesse gave them one. He convinced them that the banks were symbols of Northern power. He told them that robbing these institutions wasn't just a crime, but a continuation of their fight against the North. It was revenge, and Jesse had plenty of that to give. On February the 13th, 1866, Jesse James took part in what many historians believe was the first successful daylight bank robbery in post-war America. It happened in Liberty, Missouri, a place close to Jesse's childhood home. Jesse and his group rode into town calmly, almost casually. Inside the Clay County Savings Association, they walked up to the counter, demanded cash, and left with a fortune. No masks, no fear, no hesitation. A bystander was shot as the gang made their escape, the first of many lives that would be lost in Jesse's quest for vengeance. When the newspapers reported the robbery, a new name entered the public eye: Jesse James. Not as a soldier, not as a farm boy, but as a criminal. But Jesse wasn't just after money. He wanted to hurt the people he believed had hurt him, and he wanted the world to know why. Then tragedy struck. Archie Clement, Jesse's close friend, mentor and fellow bushwhacker, was killed by state militia. For Jesse, this wasn't simply the death of a friend. It was the loss of someone who had shaped him during the darkest years of the war. Archie's death hardened Jesse further. He began to lead with a sharper edge, a colder heart, and a deeper desire to strike back at anything connected to the Union. In the 2 years that followed, Jesse and his allies robbed banks across Missouri and Kentucky. Each robbery had a pattern: fast, direct, violent when necessary, and always executed with confidence. Newspapers started paying attention, not just because of the crimes, but because Jesse seemed fearless, because he seemed unstoppable, because he seemed different from ordinary criminals. But everything changed in December of 1869. Jesse entered the Daviess County Savings Association in Gallatin, Missouri, with one goal. He wasn't after cash that day. He wasn't after gold. He was after a man. Jesse believed the cashier, Captain John Sheets, was the same man responsible for the death of Bloody Bill Anderson, the mentor Jesse had admired during the war. Jesse wanted revenge, but Jesse was wrong. He had the wrong man. He didn't hesitate. He shot the cashier twice, once in the heart, once in the head, and rode out of town with almost nothing. It was the first time Jesse murdered someone in cold blood outside the battlefield, and it marked the moment when the state labeled him what he was becoming: an outlaw, a wanted man, a threat. But ironically, it was also the moment Jesse James transformed into a legend. Because after the Gallatin killing, a man named John Newman Edwards, founder of the Kansas City Times and a devoted Confederate sympathizer, began to write about Jesse James. Edwards painted Jesse not as a criminal, but as a Southern hero standing against Northern oppression. He turned robberies into acts of rebellion. He turned murders into war stories. He gave Jesse a voice, a stage, and a myth. And Jesse embraced it. He wrote letters to the newspapers defending his actions, claiming innocence, and accusing the government of corruption. He presented himself as a man fighting for justice, even while robbing banks across the Midwest, and people believed him. Some saw him as a criminal. Some saw him as a folk hero. But everyone, north or south, knew his name. Jesse James had become more than a man. He had become a symbol. And symbols are much harder to kill. By the early 1870s, Jesse James was no longer working alone. He and his brother Frank began joining forces with another group of hardened former guerrillas, the younger brothers, Cole, Jim, John, and Bob. Together, they formed what would become one of the most feared outlaw gangs in American history, the James Younger Gang. They were fast, they were organized, and above all, they were united by a common past, a past soaked in the violence of the Civil War. For Jesse, each robbery was more than a crime. It was a message, a reminder that he hadn't forgotten the humiliation the South suffered, the cruelty he believed the North had inflicted, and the personal wounds carved into his life. In June 1871, Jesse and his gang struck the town of Corydon, Iowa. The target was a local bank. The robbery was simple, almost effortless. The townspeople were gathered at a nearby speech, leaving the streets nearly empty. Jesse and the gang walked in calmly, emptied the vault, and walked out just as calmly. On their way back, one of the outlaws shouted to the townspeople what they had just done, as if daring anyone to stop them. The owner of that bank wasn't amused. He contacted the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. That decision would spark one of the most relentless manhunts in American crime history. But for now, Jesse wasn't worried. The gang continued their robberies across several states: Kentucky, Iowa, Missouri. They became shadows moving through the Midwest. In April 1872, the gang robbed another bank in Columbia, Kentucky. The loot wasn't impressive, but the violence was. The cashier refused to open the safe, so Jesse shot him on the spot. It was becoming increasingly clear that the line between revenge and cruelty in Jesse's mind was fading. Later that year, during a robbery at a Kansas fair, the gang stole less than $1,000. But in their escape, their horses trampled a young girl who had wandered too close. She died shortly afterward. The gang was becoming reckless, not from fear, but from confidence. They believed they were untouchable, and in many ways, they were. Law enforcement in the West was scattered, underfunded, and unprepared for men like Jesse James. The gang moved swiftly, disappearing into forests, farms, hideouts, and communities that supported them. To many Southerners, Jesse wasn't a threat. He was a symbol of resistance. But Jesse's ambitions were growing. Banks were no longer enough. He wanted bigger targets. Targets that weren't just rich, but symbolic. And in the 1870s, nothing represented the expanding power of the post-war North more than the railroads. Railroads were money. Railroads were progress. Railroads were everything Jesse believed the North was using to build its future. So Jesse decided to attack the future. In July 1873, the James Younger gang carried out one of the earliest and most dramatic train robberies in American history. They sabotaged the tracks near Adair, Iowa, forcing the train to derail. The engineer was killed instantly as the locomotive overturned. Jesse boarded the express car and demanded the key to the safe. He didn't bother hiding his identity anymore. The gang walked away with over $2,000. Not a fortune, but a statement. A statement that Jesse James was escalating. More robberies followed: stagecoaches, trains, banks. Jesse began adopting a strange philosophy that he was robbing the wealthy to defend the poor. He wasn't a Robin Hood. Never once did he distribute his stolen money to the needy, but he liked the idea of appearing as one. It made the myth stronger, and myths, Jesse knew, lasted longer than men. By January 1874, the Pinkerton agency intensified their pursuit. The Adams Express Company, the owner of one of the trains Jesse had robbed, hired the agency to bring him down. Alan Pinkerton, the founder of the agency, took this mission personally. He was a strong Union supporter. Jesse was everything he despised. The hunt had begun, and it wouldn't be long before the war Jesse thought he had escaped would come crashing back into his life. By 1874, the James Younger gang wasn't just a group of outlaws. They were national news. Across the Midwest, people whispered their names with a mix of fear and fascination. And in the offices of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, their names sparked something else entirely: determination. The Pinkertons weren't local sheriffs or small-town deputies. They were professionals, highly trained, well-funded, and committed to bringing down criminals who believed they were above the law. Alan Pinkerton, the founder of the agency, had built his reputation during the Civil War by uncovering assassination plots and protecting President Lincoln. He believed in law, order, and the strength of the Union. And Jesse James, a Confederate guerrilla turned outlaw, represented everything he stood against. So Pinkerton made a promise: he would capture Jesse James, no matter the cost. His first move was to send one of his toughest agents, Joseph Witcher, into Clay County, Jesse's home territory. Witcher's plan was simple: pose as a farm worker and gather information about the gang. But he underestimated the loyalty Jesse commanded in Missouri. Local families still saw Jesse as a hero of the Lost Confederacy. To them, the Pinkertons were outsiders, northern intruders. Witcher never had a chance. He was discovered, captured, and murdered. His body was found riddled with bullets on a lonely country road. And with that, the hunt became personal, not just for Pinkerton, but for Jesse too. As the months passed, the gang continued their robberies. But the tension in the air was growing thicker. Pinkerton agents infiltrated towns, questioned residents, and gathered intelligence. Jesse grew more paranoid, more aggressive, and more convinced that the North was trying to finish what it started during the war. In January 1875, everything exploded. Pinkerton agents surrounded the James family farmhouse late at night. They believed Jesse and Frank were inside. They weren't. Without confirming, the agents threw a device, a type of explosive, into the house. The blast tore through the wooden walls. Inside, Jesse's mother Zerelda was severely injured. Her right arm had to be amputated. Jesse's young half-brother, only 8 years old, was killed in the explosion. The Pinkertons claimed the attack was an accident. Missouri residents didn't see it that way. To them, it was an act of northern aggression against a southern family. The outrage was immediate. Crowds gathered to condemn the agency, newspapers defended the James family, and Jesse himself changed forever. The explosion lit a fire inside him deeper than any he had felt before, killing civilians, harming his family, destroying the home he grew up in. To Jesse, this wasn't law enforcement. This was war. And so he fought back. On April 12, 1875, Jesse killed a neighbor named Daniel Askew, a man he believed had aided the Pinkertons during the raid. Whether Askew was involved or not didn't matter to Jesse. He wanted vengeance. After that, Alan Pinkerton gave up the chase. The agency had lost men, lost public support, and suffered political backlash. Pinkerton himself admitted defeat, one of the few in his career. Jesse James had outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and outlasted one of the most powerful detective agencies in America. But victory had a cost. Jesse may have won his war against the Pinkertons, but he had also become exactly what the newspapers claimed he was, an outlaw fueled by revenge, a man who justified violence with memory, a legend who believed he could never be caught. And with the Pinkertons gone, Jesse felt unstoppable. Little did he know, the most dangerous chapter of his life was about to begin, a chapter that would drive him straight into the biggest disaster he would ever face. By the summer of 1876, Jesse James believed he was invincible. He had survived the Civil War, countless gunfights, and a full-scale assault by the Pinkerton agency. His gang was feared in every state they rode through. His name filled newspapers. People either admired him or despised him, but no one ignored him. But power has a way of clouding judgment, and Jesse's next move would be the biggest mistake of his life. By mid-1876, Jesse began planning a robbery unlike anything he had done before. The target was far from their home territory, deep in the north, a state that had fought for the Union with fierce loyalty. Minnesota. The idea came from Jesse and Bob Younger. They believed that striking a bank in the north would send a message, that the Confederate spirit was still alive and still capable of striking back. Frank James and Cole Younger tried to convince them it was a bad idea. The distance was too great, the territory was unfamiliar, the people were loyal to the Union, and if anything went wrong, escape would be nearly impossible. But Jesse wouldn't listen. The war inside him was still burning, and he was determined to prove something, not just to the North, but to himself. So the James Younger gang rode north. Jesse, Frank, Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger, along with 3 other members, Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, and Bill Chadwell. It was a long journey, and by the time they reached Northfield, Minnesota, they were exhausted but determined. September 7th, 1876. The gang entered town separately, trying not to draw attention. Northfield was a peaceful place. Farmers, shopkeepers, families going about their day. The target was the First National Bank of Northfield. The gang believed it held money connected to Adelbert Ames, a former Union general and governor of Mississippi. To Jesse, that made it the perfect symbol to attack. At precisely 2 p.m., Jesse, Frank, and Bob walked into the bank. They didn't waste any time. They ordered the employees to raise their hands and demanded that the safe be opened, but the employees refused. Acting cashier Joseph Lee Haywood insisted the safe could not be opened. In reality, the safe wasn't locked, but Haywood refused to give them a single dollar. Inside, the situation was falling apart. Outside, it was even worse. Local citizens began noticing what was happening. Clell Miller tried to stop a man from running for help, but it was too late. Within minutes, townspeople armed themselves with rifles and shotguns. Northfield wasn't going to be robbed without a fight. Gunfire erupted across the street. The citizens of Northfield were firing from windows, rooftops, and doorways. They were farmers and shopkeepers, but they were determined. The gang was trapped. Inside the bank, Jesse grew desperate. He cut Haywood's throat, demanding the safe be opened, but Haywood refused until the end. Bob Younger struck him with a pistol, and as Jesse and Frank tried to flee, Haywood was shot and killed. It was chaos. Clell Miller was shot dead in the street. Bill Chadwell fell moments later. Cole Younger was hit in the shoulder. Jim Younger was shot in the face. Bob Younger took a bullet to the arm. The citizens of Northfield were tearing the gang apart. The James Younger gang had come hundreds of miles to make a statement, and now they were fighting for their lives. Jesse and Frank managed to escape the main fire, riding out of town as fast as their horses could carry them. But the Younger brothers and their remaining men were severely wounded, disoriented, and surrounded by enemies. The robbery that Jesse believed would be his greatest triumph became the disaster that destroyed his entire gang. The James Younger gang would never be the same, and the largest manhunt in American history was about to begin. The Northfield robbery lasted only minutes, but its consequences would stretch for weeks and end an era of outlaw history. The moment Jesse and Frank James fled the town, the people of Northfield took action. They weren't content with simply surviving the robbery. They wanted justice. News spread rapidly through Minnesota. Within hours, armed citizens formed posses. Within days, more than 1,000 men joined the pursuit. Farmers, soldiers, lawmen, and volunteers, all determined to track down the gang that had brought bloodshed to their quiet town. For the first time, Jesse James wasn't just dealing with local sheriffs. He was facing an entire state. Jesse and Frank separated from the Younger brothers not long after the failed robbery. It was a strategic decision. The Youngers were badly wounded and slowing down. Escape with them was impossible. The James brothers headed west, hoping to lose their pursuers in the thick forests and wide plains. They traveled by night, avoided towns, and changed direction constantly. Exhausted, starving, and freezing in the early autumn chill, they pushed themselves to the limit, but the Youngers had it far worse. Cole, Jim, and Bob Younger were bleeding heavily. They moved through swamps, dense brush, and hostile terrain with little food and constant pain. Charlie Pitts stayed with them, helping where he could, but their injuries made every mile a brutal punishment. Still, they pressed on, not because they believed they could escape, but because they refused to give up. After almost 2 weeks on the run, their luck ran out. In a wooded area near Madelia, Minnesota, a posse surrounded the Younger group. With nowhere left to go, Charlie Pitts drew his revolver and fired. The posse returned fire, killing him instantly. Cole, Jim, and Bob were shot multiple times. Somehow, they survived. Their outlaw careers ended that day. Wounded, exhausted, and defeated, the Younger brothers surrendered. Later, they were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. They would never betray Jesse or Frank, not once, not even under pressure. As for the James brothers, their escape bordered on miraculous. Despite the massive manhunt, Jesse and Frank slipped through the chaos, traveling across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. They crossed rivers, hid in abandoned cabins, and lived off whatever food they could find. Each day was a battle against hunger, weather, and fear. But little by little, they pulled farther away from pursuers. Finally, after weeks of evasion, they crossed out of Minnesota and reached safety. Nearly every member of the James Younger gang had been killed, captured, or crippled. Only Jesse and Frank remained free. They had survived the most intense pursuit in American history, but the escape changed them. Frank was tired of violence, tired of hiding, tired of the life they were living. He wanted peace. Jesse wanted the opposite. He felt the failure at Northfield like a wound that refused to heal. He felt humiliated, betrayed by fate, and burned by the loss of his closest allies. The war inside Jesse, the same war that had shaped his entire life, began to consume him more than ever before. And over the next several years, that war would push him into darkness, toward paranoia, mistrust, and the kind of decisions that would eventually cost him everything. After escaping Minnesota, Jesse and Frank James vanished from public view. For the first time in years, the two brothers lived quietly, adopting false names and settling in Nashville, Tennessee. Frank embraced the quiet life. He married, worked the land, and tried to leave the past behind. For him, the outlaw days had served their purpose, and the years of violence had drained whatever fire he once had. But Jesse was different. The silence felt unnatural to him. Peace felt like a trap. The war he carried inside himself never ended. It only waited. Jesse tried farming, but he never fully adjusted to normal life. The quiet made him restless. The memories made him bitter. And the humiliation of Northfield continued to haunt him. He didn't see Northfield as a failure. He saw it as unfinished business. By 1879, Jesse began to drift back toward the only life he knew, the life of an outlaw. But he faced a new problem. His old gang no longer existed. The younger brothers were in prison for life. Charlie Pitts was dead. Other former guerrillas had either been killed or had moved on. So Jesse started building a new gang, one that lacked the loyalty, discipline, and shared history of the original group. These new recruits weren't seasoned bushwhackers. They were young men drawn in by Jesse's reputation. They admired the legend, but they didn't understand the man. Jesse sensed the difference. He became increasingly suspicious of the men he brought into his inner circle. He tested their loyalty, questioned their motives, and kept his fears hidden behind a cold exterior. Still, robberies resumed. Jesse organized a series of train and bank robberies from 1879 to 1881. Some succeeded, many failed. The new gang lacked the precision and unity of the old one, and Jesse began taking bigger risks to compensate. His paranoia grew. He believed informants were everywhere. He watched his men closely, sometimes threatening them, sometimes silently judging them. Rumors spread that Jesse had executed at least one member of his own gang for suspected betrayal. The United States had changed too. Law enforcement was better equipped, more organized, and no longer intimidated by outlaw legends. The public, once fascinated by Jesse, was now divided. Some still admired him, but many were tired of his violence. Jesse sensed the world shifting against him, but he refused to stop. He believed he was born to fight. He believed fate had chosen him to resist the North until his last breath. Then, in 1880, Jesse met two young men who would change his life forever, Charlie and Robert Ford. They were brothers from Missouri, ambitious, eager, almost desperate for notoriety. Charlie Ford joined Jesse's gang first. He admired Jesse, followed him loyally, and slowly earned his trust. Robert Ford joined later, quieter, more calculating, and far more dangerous than he appeared. Jesse, blinded by his need for dependable allies, welcomed both. But what he didn't know was that Robert Ford had his own ambition. He wanted something greater than the gang life. He wanted fame, he wanted reward money, and he wanted recognition. In secret, he began communicating with Thomas Crittenden, the governor of Missouri. Crittenden wanted Jesse James captured at any cost. He promised Ford a full pardon and a large reward if he delivered Jesse dead or alive. Robert Ford accepted. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Jesse was cautious, unpredictable, and always armed. Ford himself admitted Jesse was faster, smarter, and more aware than any man he had ever met. But he waited, quietly, patiently, watching Jesse's routines, studying his habits, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The moment that would shock the entire nation. The moment that would turn Jesse James from an outlaw into a legend. The moment that would end the story of the most famous outlaw in American history. By early 1882, Jesse James was a hunted man. Every newspaper carried his name. The reward on his head was enormous. And Robert Ford, the young recruit Jesse trusted, was now secretly working against him. Jesse didn't know it, but the walls around him were closing in. He, Charlie Ford, and Robert Ford were staying in St. Joseph, Missouri, preparing for another robbery, a bank job in Platte City. Jesse was determined to rebuild his legend after years of decline. He believed one more spectacular robbery would restore his reputation, silence his critics, and remind America that he was still untouchable. But Jesse miscalculated something critical. He trusted the wrong men. April 3rd, 1882. It was a Monday morning. The weather was calm. Jesse, as usual, woke early. Charlie and Robert Ford joined him for breakfast at the James family home. Z, Jesse's wife, prepared the meal while Jesse's children played nearby. Nothing seemed unusual, and that was exactly what made the moment deadly. After breakfast, Jesse and Charlie went outside to feed the horses. Robert remained indoors, waiting. When Jesse and Charlie returned, Jesse walked into the living room, feeling unusually warm in the spring sunlight. He took off his coat, then his vest, then he unbuckled his gun belt. For a man like Jesse, who slept with a pistol under his pillow, who never walked outside without a firearm, removing his guns was an extremely rare moment of vulnerability. He placed his revolvers on the couch. Z called from the kitchen. Charlie stood near the doorway, sweating, unable to steady his nerves. Robert Ford watched Jesse carefully, his hand already trembling over the revolver hidden in his pocket. Jesse walked toward a picture hanging on the wall near the mantel. The frame was dusty. He reached up to straighten it, a harmless gesture he had done countless times before. Robert Ford saw his chance. He lifted his revolver, slowly, quietly. The sound Jesse heard next was unmistakable, the metallic click of a hammer being cocked. He began to turn, but the shot had already been fired. The bullet entered just behind Jesse's right ear, killing him instantly. He collapsed to the floor without a word. The most wanted man in America, the outlaw that no lawman could catch, the legendary Jesse James, was dead at the age of 34, killed by a man he trusted, shot in the back of the head, without warning, without a fight. Within minutes, the story spread. Neighbors gathered outside the house. A doctor confirmed what everyone already knew. Jesse James, son, husband, father, and outlaw, was gone. Robert and Charlie Ford surrendered themselves immediately, expecting to be hailed as heroes. Instead, the public reaction shocked them. Across America, people were furious, not because Jesse was innocent, but because killing a man in his own home, unarmed and unprepared, was seen as an act of pure cowardice. Jesse James died an outlaw, but the manner of his death turned him into something else, a martyr, a folk hero, a symbol of resistance, rebellion, and defiance. More than 2,000 people attended his funeral. Crowds flooded the cemetery, not to celebrate his death, but to honor the legend he had become. The Fords, meanwhile, were charged with first-degree murder. In a single day, they were convicted, sentenced to hang, and pardoned by Governor Crittenden, who had secretly arranged the entire plot. But the pardons didn't save them. Charlie Ford committed suicide 2 years later, consumed by illness and guilt. Robert Ford wandered the West, hated everywhere he went. 10 years after killing Jesse James, he was shot dead in a Colorado saloon. Some said it was justice, others said it was fate. As for Frank James, he surrendered to the law months after Jesse's death. He faced trial several times and was acquitted every time. Frank spent the rest of his life peacefully on a farm and died in 1915, in the very home where he was born. Jesse's wife, Z, lived the rest of her life in grief and poverty, never fully recovering from the loss, and the legend of Jesse James only grew. Over time, he became more than a criminal, more than a guerrilla fighter, more than an outlaw. He became a symbol of rebellion, vengeance, defiance, and the bitter scars of the American Civil War. A man shaped by violence, driven by revenge, remembered as a hero by some, a villain by others, and a legend by all. Jesse James lived and died in a world shaped by war, a world where loyalty was everything, and revenge was a language spoken more clearly than forgiveness. To some, he was a cold-blooded criminal, a man who took lives, robbed trains, and left chaos in his wake. To others, he was a symbol of resistance, a Southerner who refused to bow to the North, a figure who fought for a lost cause long after the war had ended. But history rarely gives us simple men. Instead, it gives us complicated lives, wounded hearts, and choices carved by the times people were born into. Jesse James was one of those lives, raised in conflict, forged by war, driven by vengeance, and remembered long after the bullets stopped firing. His story forces us to confront a difficult truth. Heroes and villains are often separated only by perspective, by where we stand, by what we choose to believe. In the end, Jesse James didn't die in a blazing showdown. He didn't fall in a duel or an ambush in the dust. He died in his own home, in the quiet of an ordinary morning, betrayed by someone he trusted. And perhaps that is the final lesson of his life, that for all the danger he survived, all the gunfights he won, the greatest threat he ever faced was not the law or the Pinkertons or the men who hunted him. It was the people he let close. Jesse James remains one of the most debated figures in American history, a man who still divides opinion more than a century later. Some say he was a monster, some say he was a martyr, some say he was a product of his time, shaped, broken, and remade by a war that never truly ended for him. And now, after hearing his story, what do you think? Was Jesse James a hero for his cause, a ruthless outlaw, or something far more complex? His shadow still lingers over the American West, but the meaning of that shadow, that perhaps is for you to decide.